This is AIM Agenda. Thanks for your company. With me this morning, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Steve Ciobo, and the Shadow Financial Services Minister, Bernie Ripoll. Gentlemen, good morning to you. I want to start with a debate about the Federation and indirect tax, the GST. Is that what the Prime Minister was softening up everyone for, wanting to get that debate underway?
Well, I think the Prime Minister made a statement of the obvious in terms of the eyes of the Australian public, which is that our federation at times can be a bit of a dog's breakfast. So the Prime Minister was making the point that Australians rightly have an expectation that they will get quality services provided and infrastructure by the federal government and by the state government. There's a lot of duplication. It's often unclear who's in charge. Is it state? Is it local? Is it federal? I think the Prime Minister made the valid point that we need to have a mature conversation, an open conversation about what's going to make this nation stronger in the future by sorting out some of this duplication and getting the settings right so that we have a better tomorrow.
Is it code for we need to look at the GST and the rate of the GST, the base?
Look, Kieran, it absolutely is not. And frankly, it was very disappointing that Bill Shorten and the Labor Party was so quick out of the blocks to say Tony Abbott wants to raise the GST. Complete and utter
So
rubbish.
what are the other options then? Talk us through what are the other things that the government could do to bolster the state's revenue base.
Sure. Well, the point is there's actually a variety of options available. That includes, for example, whether we look at the mix between income tax between the federal and states. I mean, don't forget, before the Uniform Tax Agreement, states would levy their own income tax, and obviously the federal government would levy a smaller proportion. There's also discussions around some of those inefficient indirect taxes, discussions as well in relation to proposals that states might put forward, and all states would need to do this. The Labor states as well would need to put forward a proposal in terms of GST. So we've got a variety of options. The important point to stress, though, is this. The Prime Minister made it clear that we should not see an increase in the tax burden by all Australians. So what we're talking about here is the change in the mix of taxes and not an increase in the tax burden.
Why does Labor immediately go for the knee-jerk scare on the GST? If you have appropriate compensation, what's the problem with this? Doesn't it help to avoid tax avoidance by having a consumption tax?
Well, Kieran, the first thing is it's another broken promise by Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott does want to put up the GST, but he wants the states to do it for him. He knows he can't do it. He can't do it directly, so he's putting the pressure on the states to do it, and that's the reality. And the fact he's doing it through stealth. So Tony Abbott and the Liberals have cut some $80 billion of funding going forward, looking at education and health to the states, putting the pressure on the states, telling them that it's not fair, that the GST is not equal amongst all the states, and saying to them if they want to fix this problem and they want to get some of their funding back, the way for the states to do it is to agree to a hike in the GST.
So, but explain to me why a GST is wrong when, say, for example, the carbon tax, which Labor introduced, was a regressive tax. You did that on the basis of compensation, though, for the less well-off. Why not do the same if it's going to avoid
Kieran,
the issue of people
let's get one thing
avoiding tax? Because rich people are going to spend a hell of a lot more.
Kieran, let's at least in this room be serious about this. Now, everyone might accept that we just called it a carbon tax, but it's not, and it was never a tax. It was not, it's just referred to or known as, and it's very different to a GST, a goods and services tax, which is very clearly a tax, and it's a tax on every single person, and it is not fairly distributed in that sense. And so there was compensation for a carbon price, a carbon pricing mechanism, but there's not compensation for a GST. So it's not the same thing.
It could be, though. Why wouldn't it be?
Well, ask Tony Abbott, ask Steve Ciobo, and ask why they couldn't do that. But it comes back to your central point, is why are we talking about this? Because everybody knows, and you know, and so does Steve Ciobo know, that Tony Abbott wants to put up the GST. That's why we're discussing this, and that's why they're putting pressure on the states.
But you say
your line of questioning is around that. Well, why not this and why not that?
Steve Ciobo, I just want to drill down on the options here, because obviously what the Prime Minister says makes an enormous amount of sense to reform the Federation, to streamline the tax system and so on, and make it more sustainable for the states. But the question I put to you is, if you have income tax for the states, that's a duplication, another duplication. You're adding another level of complexity. Surely the option is to have indirect taxation and the government provide greater compensation. Thereby the states don't have to generate their own tax.
Kieran, and I understand your desire to want the solution being put forward already, but the point is we're not at that stage of the discussion. We're at the very front end of the discussion where we're saying, look, we recognise what Australians all around the country say to us as elected members of Parliament on a daily basis, which is that there's a bit of a dog's breakfast with our federation, there's a lot of duplication, it's often unclear who's paying for what, you see the argy-bargy between the state governments and the federal governments. I mean, none of what I'm saying is rocket science and none of what I'm saying is shocking or new. The Prime Minister has encapsulated that sentiment across the community and said, look, let's have a conversation about it. Let's work out a way forward. Now, frankly, what I just heard from Bernie was 5 minutes of unadulterated, complete and utter rubbish. He should be the chief propagandist, frankly, for the Labor Party. I mean, he's out there saying, well, Tony Abbott's trying to put up the GST by stealth, and the Labor's carbon tax wasn't a tax, it was a carbon pricing mechanism, whatever the hell that means. I mean, talk about double Dutch. So, I just think the Labor Party needs to look the Australian people in the eye and recognise that we're not trying to be political on this. We're actually trying to set our nation up for a better tomorrow by having mature conversation. And the kind of knee-jerk populism that we're hearing from Labor, frankly, just erodes the future of this country.
Isn't it true that New Zealand had a mature conversation led by the McLeod review, I think it was from memory, and that John Key raised the consumption rate, the consumption tax rate? Their argument being that in some ways it's a luxury tax, because if you have compensation for those less well off, those who are spending a lot more on luxury items and so on are going to be taxed appropriately with a greater consumption.
Well, Kieran, I don't know who the people are that Steve Ciobo's talking to, but when I talk to people on the street, they don't talk to me about the dog's breakfast of federation. They actually say to me, we don't want to see the GST go up. That's more closely related to the real conversations that most of us would have on the street with ordinary people. Now, whatever New Zealand does, that's fine, and I'm happy to have a conversation about a whole range of things, but the reality is that the Prime Minister of this country made a promise. He made a promise not to increase taxes, and he's broken that promise already in a range of areas. We don't want to see...
So you said you're happy to have a conversation about a range of things. Is that on the GST though as well? You'd be open to that?
Kieran, we're having a conversation about it right now. I'm happy to have a conversation about it right now.
Do you think there could be merit for lifting the rate?
Look, I'm happy to discuss this every single day with you and anyone else who wants to discuss it with me, because that's the reality of life when you go out on the street and people talk to you about a whole range of issues. They're not talking to me about dog's breakfast of federation. That's just made up. What they do talk to me about is saying that cost of living pressures, which Tony Abbott promised he would lower, that's not the case.
You see the argument, the economic argument for why the states need a greater share of taxation stream, of revenue, and that this might be the option.
Well,
with appropriate compensation.
Well, Kieran, right here in a few minutes, we're not going to get down to, resolving the world's problems and how the states...
You sound at least open to it, which is something Labor hasn't been.
Well, Kieran, Labor's always open to discuss a whole range of things, and we do. And some conversations we have, and we have very strong policy and very strong principles on those issues, including what our electors and what we believe Australia is better served by which policies. And if that means that Tony Abbott wants to go out and break a promise, that's his choice, not ours. That's not our decision, that's his decision. So quite simply, this has been put back on the table by those who want to increase GST, Tony Abbott. This has not been put back on the table by Labor. The reason we're having a conversation about it right now is because Tony Abbott has squarely put this on the table, and he said to the states, you want more money? Put up the GST.
You're open to turnbacks now as well, boat turnbacks. We've only got 2 minutes left, but you've heard what Scott Morrison says.
And I've heard what Richard Marles has said as well.
Scott Morrison says that essentially this is pathetic because you've said, OK, well, we might support this, but you're not committing to it. And he doesn't believe that you would support turnbacks, even though Mr Marles has conceded it's working.
Sure. In a very brief answer, the issue of turnbacks is before the High Courts, and it needs to be resolved there first before we are in a position to make any further decision on that.
So you're in a holding pattern on your policy?
Look, I don't know. You can call it whatever you want, just like you can call a carbon tax when it's really a carbon pricing system. You call it whatever you like. The reality is I heard what Richard Marles said. What Richard Marles said is that our regional processing arrangements, Nauru and Manus Islands, before the last election had already made a huge impact, and boats did stop coming because no one coming by boat was going to get any.
It's reasonable to suggest that no matter how far Labor goes on this policy, Scott Morrison will always say, that's not far enough.
Kieran, it's very straightforward. We heard weasel words from Labor. In 2014, there's been one boat reach Australian waters, one boat. Under Labor, over 12 months, 401 boats, more than one a day. The contrast could not be more stark.
Gentlemen, we're out of time.
Thank you.
Steve Ciobo, Bernie Ripoll. A quick break, back in just a moment.